Well, you guys made it loud and clear you wanted more Skybound content, and I'm all for talking about this fun new universe some more, so today we're going to talk about the other half of the Energon Universe's licensed properties, G.I. Joe. Now, the Joe side of things is pretty interesting because instead of just starting an ongoing series like Transformers, they opted to instead launch multiple mini-series to establish the big players ahead of time. Presumably so readers are familiar with them by the time they do start an ongoing Joe team book, probably because the likes of Duke and Destro aren't as well known to casual readers like Optimus Prime and Starscream are. So it's kinda like they took the MCU approach and applied it to their comics. Today we'll be taking a look at Phase 1, so to speak, with Duke and Cobra Commander. I want to preface this ahead of time. I am not a G.I. Joe fan. Not to say I hate the franchise, far from it. I've just never had much interest in it or much knowledge about any of this. I've seen the movies everyone hates, but that's as far as that goes. So I'm going in more or less completely blind with these. These comics could actually be committing some heinous acts about Joe lore, and I'd be none the wiser. We'll start off with Duke first, and then we'll discuss Cobra Commander. Unlike the Transformers video, both of these are only 5 issues long, so not really long enough for me to have any meaningful discussion while avoiding spoilers. I'll try and skirt around some, but consider this your one and only spoiler warning if you haven't been keeping up with the Energon Universe thus far. So let's talk about Duke. Before I start with the contents of the comic itself, I'd just like to mention how shockingly difficult it was to get my hands on all 5 issues for this video. I stopped in at my usual comic shop and managed to find issues 1, 3, 4, and 5 without a problem, but they didn't have issue 2 in stock. After the first came out, the comic skyrocketed in popularity, so the first and second printings of issue 2 were completely sold out. Given everything else was easy to find, I guess sales fell off somewhat, which makes sense. Comic sales usually do fall off over time. They offered to give me a call if they managed to get any copies in stock, but given I still never heard back after all that, that's kind of a dead end. So, I had to get resourceful. I called every single comic shop within driving distance of my area, about 5 in total, and only one had the missing issue I needed. That would be a nice little place by the name of Tim's Corner Comics. The staff were all super friendly, and without them, this video wouldn't be possible. So a huge thank you to Tim's Corner Comics. If any of you guys are in the area, make sure to stop by and just support your local comic shops in general. Okay, on to the actual comic now. Who's our team this time around? So, for both comics, we actually have the same writer, Joshua Williamson. He started making a name for himself working for DC in the late 2010s, with titles such as Robin, and what I mainly know him for is run on The Flash during DC Rebirth, which lasted for just over 100 issues, which is pretty impressive in this day and age. I wasn't really a fan of his work on The Flash, so needless to say I was a little hesitant when I saw he was the writer for these two. But hey, I'm always open to being proven wrong. Our artist here is Tom Riley, who seems to be pretty new to the industry. The only work of his that I can find prior to this is Morbius Bond of Blood, and a 4-issue Ant-Man series from 2022. And honestly, I hope to see him work on more comics in the future. His style is fun and works perfectly for the vibe G.I. Joe generally aims for, while still being able to sell the dark, serious moments perfectly. Duke starts off on a pretty interesting note as we don't actually meet the title character for the first time in his own comic. Rather, Duke's first appearance is in Transformers number 2, which starts off his arc for the entirety of his solo title. So basically, he has a near-fatal encounter with Starscream, which mentally breaks him for 2 reasons. First, holy crap, those are robots that turn into jets, so that's a lot to process on its own. And secondly, his buddy and co-pilot Frosting is killed in the attack, literally swatted like a bug by Starscream. So Duke feels responsible for this, as Frosting was just giving him a ride back to base as a favor to a friend. And to top it all off, he's been placed on indefinite leave, and no one believes him because obviously they wouldn't. He also picks up on there being more to this story than meets the eye, and Colonel Hawk is actively trying to steer him away from looking into it, which has the exact opposite effect as Duke goes on a mission to find answers as one man, alone, betrayed by the country he loves, a renegade. This takes him on a 6-month-long search for answers, which raises some questions about the Energon Universe's timeline. The last page of Duke number 5 shows him being given a photo of Optimus Prime, which seems to be from when he fought Devastator in Transformers number 6. So either Duke and Cobra Commander, which by all accounts seem to take place over roughly the same stretch of time, take place months ahead of Transformers, or the first 6 issues of Transformers take place over a much longer period than how it's presented. This has no actual bearing over anything actually happening in any of these comics. It just throws me for a loop more than it reasonably should. Anyway, Duke went rogue, so Colonel Hawk sics other classic Joe characters on him to bring him into custody. Stalker and Rock and Roll. They're interesting to see work as a duo. It's like approaching brain surgery from 2 different angles. Stalker's like using a scalpel, quiet and precise. And Rock and Roll is like hacking away at it with a chainsaw, loud and with all the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. Both are really good at what they do. I don't know if this necessarily gels with how they were characterized in the Real American Hero era, but I definitely want to see more of them going forward. Duke's main partner in crime during this whole ordeal is Clutch, a good friend of his long before either of them even joined the military. He's basically a technical wizard with anything that has an engine, with a penchant for skirt chasing, but ultimately he's a pretty good dude that you can rely on. Kind of like a Tony Stark type in that regard, minus the rampant alcoholism. As you can probably guess, these 4 will basically be the founding members of G.I. Joe once they have an opposing force to go after. And what better opposing force than the massive organization led by a merciless leader, the organization headed by the villainous shiny face of the franchise, Destro, and his weapons manufacturing company, Mars. What, were you expecting someone else with a chrome mask? Jokes aside, I like that they use Destro as the central antagonist for this comic. It makes perfect sense in context. Duke sneaks into Mars, sees they've been building war machines such as his tanks, and assumes that obviously this is the dude responsible for the jet robot that attacked him. Which we have the benefit of knowing it's a misunderstanding, but it makes perfect sense how he'd come to that conclusion with zero knowledge of the Transformers. This leads to an intense conflict between Duke, the American government, and Destro's operation, which is a fascinating source of internal and external conflict. Larry Hama, the guy who's been the main writer for G.I. Joe stuff, whether it be character bios or full comics since the start of the RAH era, has gone on record talking about how hard it is to write Duke. His personality being so straightforward and so perfectly good and heroic just makes it naturally hard to write interesting conflicts with him, which, given that Hama is essentially the godfather of modern G.I. Joe, I'm inclined to believe him for this. I like that Duke has obviously spiraled quite a lot since the attack by Starscream, but he's not an unlikable train wreck of a human being. It's believable and kinda neat seeing a normally clean-shaven, buzz-cutted man like him rocking the Steve Rogers Nomad style. I doubt it'll last past this series, but I appreciate the novelty. Enough about the good guys, I'd like to talk about the villains that Duke has to survive against. We don't get many, but I appreciate the few we do see. You've got Destro, who's great, plotting and scheming while looking like a cherry-flavored pimp who walked straight out of Miami Vice. We also got Major Blood, who's a delightful Australian mercenary. He's a cutthroat businessman in more ways than one, but he's just so much fun to watch. And on the other side of the spectrum, we've got Mercer, basically Destro's hired muscle, and Scrap Iron, who's a run-of-the-mill arsonist. The most I have to say about these two is that they exist. We even get a look at early models of the Battle Android Troopers, or BATs, which end up being more than a match for Duke, though their major downfall is an insufficient power source. I wonder if they'll eventually crack that particular issue down the line. In the end, Duke does eventually more or less get the answers he was wanting. Starscream was in fact not created by Destro, but is led to believe that they were built by someone, which I can only assume will be the main reason he comes into conflict with Cobra as a whole. But the main takeaway is that the whole thing was a setup by Colonel Hawk so Duke would unknowingly get vital intel on Destro for the government, and Hawk needs him to lead a new top-secret team for fighting the more colorful threats that are now popping up, such as other robots that turn into trucks and the like, which he's suddenly all too eager to take on. This particular exchange feels odd to me, like Williamson suddenly remembered that this was only 5 issues and had to wrap it up fast. Duke goes from questioning everything he's ever believed to agreeing to lead G.I. Joe without hesitation. I think if I were the one writing this, I would have tweaked it so Duke agrees but with his own terms and conditions. and still not completely trusting his government after seeing how they'll gladly use him for their own means while keeping him in the dark. The ending doesn't completely ruin it for me, it just feels a little too neatly wrapped up for my liking. Granted, this is essentially just a prologue for the G.I. Joe status quo going forward. Overall, Duke was okay. It did what it set out to do, which is familiarize readers new and old with how this new version of Conrad Hauser will think and act going forward, as well as set up the supporting cast and some of the recurring villains. It's not a bad comic by any means, I just highly prefer the next one we'll be discussing, which is... yeah, that guy. This is also written by Williamson, but with art by Andrea Milana, who does a really great job with melding the classic Sunbow aesthetics, but in a more mature and, dare I say, grounded tone and world. Nothing about what we see here in this comic is in any way realistic, but everything is dialed down just enough to be taken seriously. He's also pretty much brand new to the industry, with work dating back to 2022 at the earliest, on titles such as Dahlia in the Dark and Impact Winter Rook. If his art in that looks anywhere near as good as this, I might really need to check those out. So, Snake Sergeant begins on a really intriguing note in Cobra Law, introduced in the 1986 movie and swiftly forgotten about due to the backlash it and everyone in it got from fans, which in a surprising power move is exactly why Williamson is putting such an emphasis on Cobra Law as a global power, operating in secret from the outside world. So, part of the problem fans have with Cobra Law is how it seemed to retcon the commander into being a citizen from there, but Williamson found an interesting middle ground. Here, he's an outsider who, in a rare act of generosity, I suppose, was let in as one of their own. Whether or not he was still a used car salesman beforehand is still unclear at this time. So he's sent out on his own by Globulus to find new energy sources, since Cobra Law's isolationist tendencies mean resources are dwindling and tensions are high. Tensions are high because the commander is a little glitch and riled up the populace to begin with, either because he was hoping Globulus would be dethroned, or so he'd send him out on some mission to regain Cobra Law's favor. That bit isn't explicitly stated and is speculation on my part, but given this is Python President we're talking about, it feels pretty likely for both cases. Luckily, he's already found a great energy source, Energon. And if you watched my Skybound Transformers video or have read the comics, you already know where this is going. He found this courtesy of Megatron, who he found at some point and captured, as a means of reverse engineering Cybertronian technology for his new army he wants to start up. But Megatron can only supply so much Energon on his own. Mamba Major needs to find more of it and figure out how to create more of it himself. So he goes on a globetrotting adventure to do just that alongside his bodyguard, who hates him and honestly couldn't care less about his well-being. All the while, he encounters all sort of riffraff like the Dreadnoks and Florida wildlife that's been enhanced by Energon, which is actually fascinating to witness. I don't think we've seen the effect stuff like this would have on native life in other Transformers media. And the Dreadnoks are pretty hardcore. They torture him in some pretty intense ways, and he doesn't give them any information, which is genuinely impressive. If anything, he just causes them to turn on one another using that forked silver tongue of his. This leads to getting on the bad side of Anaconda Admiral's enforcer, his nemesis enforcer, who straight up slaughters most of them. But they got what they came for, Energon and how to make more of it. And time to tie up loose ends, as Nemesis Enforcer's real mission was to kill the commander once he started to outlive his usefulness. He manages to defend himself using Iron Man's watch repulsor from Civil War, and it's presented as if he killed Nemesis Enforcer, but I've got this itch in the back of my head telling me it's not actually that easy to just kill him. But in any case, he's got one last stop to make for this little adventure. An army needs weapons, and where better to get them from the top weapons manufacturer in the world, Mars. So Viper Voivode does the courteous thing and invites Destro into his home. And by home, I mean a nondescript American town he's set up as a testing ground for the express purpose of slaughtering Destro's troops to prove a point. What exactly that point is, I'm not sure, but I'm not about to try reasoning with him about it. Basically, he offers Destro this. He's got the perfect energy source for his bats. Hey, remember how a problem in Duke was that they didn't have a strong enough energy source? Well, here it is. Energon only the commander knows how to procure and create more of. And in exchange, Destro supplies troops and weapons of war. Destro is really just going along with this out of morbid curiosity with what's going on with the jet robot Duke mentioned, naturally assuming CC built it, as well as wanting to figure out how Energon works for himself. So we're already establishing that dynamic of Destro and Diamondback Director being ready to backstab one another at a moment's notice. So our comic ends here with Cobra Law reeling from Megatron's then recent escape from the one-shot Energon Universe 2024 special, and their own discovery of the Transformers, who they see as a threat to their purely organic way of life. So Pythona shoots off an organic probe. Sounds fragging gross, might I add. So Cobra Law can find and destroy Cybertron before Cybertron can destroy them first. That seems a tad extreme, but I'm not going to try and rationalize the tactical prowess of the dude who looks like this. Meanwhile, in the human world, Cobra Commander has his organization and is ready to make the world rue the name. Overall, I really enjoyed this one, definitely more than I enjoyed Duke. Duke wasn't bad by any means, but this one definitely kept me hooked from month to month. I initially just picked up issue 1 because of the Megatron connection, and halfway through I stopped and thought, wait, this is actually really cool? And this actually got me invested in G.I. Joe as a whole. While writing this very script, I binged all of Renegades, which admittedly doesn't sound as impressive when you remember it was just one season, but still. Wait, back on track. I really appreciate how interconnected these two feel, yet still standalone enough for you to be able to read one or the other and still be completely understandable on its own, which is a really great benefit of both series being written by the same guy at the same time. It also really caught me off guard just how violent both could get. Duke wasn't too bad, but man, Cobra Commander got seriously grisly at some points. I guess Kirkman really wanted to emphasize this isn't like your daddy's G.I. Joe. So yeah, I'd highly recommend Cobra Commander if you haven't read it already. Duke's a fine read too, but if you could only pick one up, CC is where it's at. But these two minis do have me intrigued to see what Scarlet and Destro have to offer for the Joe side of things. I can only assume we'll be getting an ongoing Joe series after those two wrap up. Skybound hasn't announced anything yet, but I can't really think of anyone else that needs a full mini-series to set up. Maybe Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow? But the Arishikage clan are already going to show up in Scarlet, and Snake Eyes is the face of the entire franchise, so he doesn't really need an introduction. You know, come to think of it, Hasbro has been trying so hard to make G.I. Joe work for a modern audience, especially in the live-action sense, but Skybound accomplished what they've been trying for over a decade in the span of just 6 months. Hey, you want to know how to make G.I. Joe work in the modern day? How to set up your big Hasbro cinematic universe? Just do this. Embracing what made the Real American Hero era so popular to begin with, while giving it a bit more edge than an 80s cartoon meant to sell toys could get away with, but not so serious that you just drain the fun out of it. You don't have to give Duke a jet black armored exoskeleton or Destro a nanotech face. You can still embrace the sci-fi angle with stuff like bats and hiss tanks. Do your Duke and Commander origin movies so audience don't just groan when you announce your Transformers G.I. Joe crossover film and they actually care about the characters showing up. I've seen people say the franchise should just stay dead and it has no place outside the 80s, but the fact that I've been sitting here gushing about how these comics made me a fan is clear evidence to the contrary. The fact that Williamson and Kirkman took a comic that was selling just well enough to avoid cancellation to comic shops completely selling out of first and second printings of each issue is proof that all of this can still work. You just need to get creatives like these mad lads who love these characters and know what needs updating and what doesn't. So as for the future of the Energon universe on the channel, next up is the first arc of Void Rivals, Scarlet and Destro once they've wrapped up, followed by whatever Transformers is cooked up by that point. But that's enough rambling from me for today. Let me know what you guys thought of the comics down in the comments below. This has been Banger Disaster signing off. Thank you for watching, and make sure to look away from your screen for at least 20 seconds to avoid eye strain.